the Roman, when his burning heart was slaked with blood of Rome, threw down the dagger, dared depart in savage grandeur home. Lord Byron. When the forces of a united monarchical Europe ousted the great Roman, Napoleon, the restored Bourbon king Louis XVIII gave Jacques-Louis David, Napoleon's court painter, amnesty. However, David, who had seen and painted his way through the First Revolution and then dictatorial coup d'etat, decided that enough was enough. He exiled himself from Paris and settled in Brussels. Why not stay? The king had also offered him a position as court painter, again under the restored crown. Perhaps David's loyalties still lay with the ousted Napoleon, and he saw the return to the old way of ruling nations by divine religious right as a step in the wrong direction, a step backwards. Perhaps, in order to emulate his greatest subject, he chose to follow him into the legend of his exile. Although the days that David had chronicled were gone, the changes dealt by the French Revolution, and more importantly by the superhero figure that was Napoleon in his time, could not be stopped. The main tenets of the revolution were developed initially as reason, or the rational power of the human mind. However, as the revolution progressed, reason took on a more collective meaning. It was the spirit of revolution that dominated France, and it would be the imaginative reality of Napoleon's story that transformed the spirit of revolution into the spirit of Romanticism. The spirit of revolution implied a distinct advancement or reaction to the notions developed by René Descartes. Spirit implied not only a mind that worked to create distinctions within the observed world, but a personal and unique body whose passions not only drove the artist but connected him with other kindred souls. The body was not separate from the mind, like the philosopher Descartes wrote, but rather made up one single entity which constituted man's individual spirit. After Napoleon, artists would begin painting for a new popular conception of viewership, one that would reflect the desires and dreams of the people themselves. The Romantic artists also generated through poetic engagement the energy they thought people needed to wake to the reality of their feudal imprisonment and call them to action. Romanticism developed alongside the widespread popularization of liberalism. As the century progressed, revolutionaries across Europe would demand liberal constitutions dedicated to the rights of man. However, the zeitgeist of the new movement demanded not only political passion and creative zeal, but also greatness from its individuals. It demanded new Napoleons who would transform the landscape of art, science, politics, and religion into the vision of Arcadia that gripped the Enlightenment theoreticians. In particular, the 19th century exploded with great artists, each inspired to tread new ground and develop a grand style or purpose for their paintings.
Why your reason? Why do we need your reason? Reason excludes divinity, but it also dispels the paranormal. The sleep of reason produces monsters, nightmares.
The artists of the 1780s and 90s lived through a time when the utopianism of the Enlightenment had begun to wane. Reason was an inadequate response to the indifference of the natural world, but a world without reason was a dangerous place. Francisco Goya observed in the people of Spain a lingering belief in the darkly supernatural. Henry Fuseli sparked a profound fascination with dreams and their representation. Fuseli in turn influenced William Blake, who claimed to have had visions of heaven and of hell. The earliest influences on Romanticism, Goya, Blake, and Fuseli, concern themselves with vision. All three watched from their own countries as the events of the French Revolution would explode into visionary proportion. On the 2nd of May, 1808, after Napoleon had invaded the Iberian Peninsula and placed his brother on the Spanish throne, the people of Spain rose up against their French occupiers. On the following day, French forces rounded up as many of the rebels as they could find and executed them by firing squad. Goya depicted the events of the 2nd and 3rd of May in two paintings which in the turmoil of the resulting Peninsular War were not exhibited. The 3rd of May shows the French soldiers who have transformed from human beings into rational machines, administering death to the all-too-human Spanish rebels. A lamp, carrying the symbol of the Enlightenment's radiance, shines in the terrified group of victims. The unstoppable momentum of the revolution had transformed reason from a rallying cry to fight tyranny to a mechanized instrument of woe. In his Disasters of War series of prints, Goya shows a clash between French soldiers and Spanish patriots. The title reads, "With or without reason." With or without reason, the result is the same: violence, death, destruction. Although Napoleon would eventually be forced to exit Spain, leaving the native guerrillas victorious, Goya would find little comfort in his later years. He felt the rational glow of the Enlightenment recede, and the dark heart of Spain's superstitious folklore crowd in on him. Deaf and suffering from a mysterious hallucinatory disease, Goya would eventually leave Spain altogether, living out his last days in, of all places, France. Fuseli was a Swiss national, but he stayed most of his life in England. There, he met Sir Joshua Reynolds, the first head of the Royal Academy of Arts in London. Reynolds encouraged Fuseli, then in his late 20s, to pursue painting, and in 1770 he went to Rome. Rome was the capital of the arts in 18th century Europe. Goya, too, had made a pilgrimage to Rome in his youth. His Hannibal Viewing Italy from the Alps makes a fine premonition of Napoleon, and fits right in with the black backgrounds of Fuseli, too. In 1778, Fuseli returned to England, where 3 years later his painting Nightmare won him widespread attention by the viewing public. Fuseli was perhaps one of the first artists who captured the public's imagination. The arrangement of dreamlike elements in an almost neoclassical style, night terrors thick with irony and eroticism. Fuseli had evidently caught on to some unconscious fascination in the popular mind, a darker sexual element that would haunt the spirit of the age until Freud. Fuseli was also popular for the openly erotic nature of many of his paintings. Some works were more explicit than others, and after his death, his wife would burn many of his drawings. Love, both spiritual and physical, also prefigured the work of William Blake, as it would for later Romantics. Profoundly religious, Blake reveled in contradiction, and through his imaginative works mapped a mythopoetic narrative which characterized elements of the body as they related to notions of Dante and Milton's hell, as well as to popular contemporary interpretations of the Holy Trinity. Blake believed that spirituality was fourfold, and that these divisions, or zoas, were represented in the body of man. The first zoa was tharmas, which represented the overall sensation of the body. Next was luva, who represented the sensation of the heart. Then Urthona, the loins, and finally Urizen, the deity of the head, the brain. Together, the four zoas made up the united spirit of the people that Blake knew in England. Indeed, he believed together they formed another mythological character, Albion, who was the symbol of England as a nation. This raising up of his own country and people was the prototype of Romanticism's inclination towards nationalism. One of Blake's most famous poems, Jerusalem, is considered by many to be an unofficial national anthem of England. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? The Revolution would introduce the power of large groups of people connected in spirit. The Romantics of the 19th century would develop the notions of connectedness between people who shared the same geography and way of life, but would also deepen and define the boundaries that separated the lands they occupied into nations. Although David had created grand narrative scenes for Napoleon, the artist who defined the time period of the Napoleonic Wars was the Baron Gros. When the war was over, the restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, offered him the position of court painter, and he accepted.
Nature averse to crime? I tell you, nature lives and breathes by it. Hungers at all her pores for bloodshed, aches in all her nerves for the help of sin, yearns with all her heart for the furtherance of cruelty.
Jericho was born in 1791. The revolution in France had begun just 3 years before, and would only intensify as Jericho grew into his youth. Jericho's fascination with neoclassicism would throughout his life clash sharply with the clear romantic spirit that compelled his images. He was the artist who defined the French romantic genre before Delacroix, and managed to capture in oil paint the images of fear, death, and war that had terrorized the French public for nearly 30 years. These are the history paintings that define the time period of the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. The Romantics, up until this point, depicted the violence of the collision between reason and its opposite, the irrational elements of life, desire, faith, love, sin, that make up human nature. Nature was not for the Romantics merely an appreciation for the world outside, but also an acknowledgement that the wildness and unpredictability of Mother Earth existed inside the human being as well. Reason and human nature now had to, if not reconcile, at least share the same space and live in peace for the time being. War and revolution had raged for nearly 25 years. There comes a definite point in every civilization when it is given to human intelligence to display its full power. In this brief moment, like a flash of lightning in a dark and cloudy sky, there seems scarcely any interval between the first dawning of the brilliant light and the last gleam of its splendor. Madame Viau invited me to spend the evening to meet a mysterious young lady, a friend of Madame Sand. I went there in spite of my cold and in torrents of rain. There I found Madame Plessis, a charming young lady who made me promise to write to Madame Sand on her behalf. Thought. First thoughts. The first main outlines with which a skillful master indicates his thought contain the germ of every characteristic that the work will ultimately possess. Raphael, Rembrandt, Poussin. I purposely mention these painters because they excelled above all by the quality of their thought. Flung a few swift lines upon the paper, not one of which appears unimportant. To the intelligent eye, the life of the picture is already apparent everywhere, and nothing in the subsequent development of the theme, vague though it appears, will deviate from this conception, which is already complete, although it has scarcely unfolded itself to the light. Can this being, whose existence he feels and may not question, continue to live when its habitation of bone and flesh, in which the blood circulates and the nerves perform their functions, has ceased to be the active workshop, the laboratory of life that maintains itself amidst opposing elements, and despite many accidents and vicissitudes? When the eyes have ceased to see, what becomes of the sensations that reach the poor soul, sheltered I know not where, through these windows onto the outside world? You will say that the soul remembers when it has seen, and lives and consoles itself by its memories. But if memory itself should die, memory which does, after a fashion, replace sound and hearing, and the other senses which we lose one after another, what then will keep alive the invisible flame? What becomes of the soul when paralysis or imbecility have driven it to the last refuge? On the power of thought and imagination with which man is gifted. Fatal gifts. It clearly matters very little to nature whether man has a mind or not. No sooner does man sharpen his wits, enlarge his ideas and his manner of expressing them, and develop his needs, than he finds nature frustrating him at every turn. He has to be continually at war with her, and she on her side does not remain inactive. If man ceases for a moment from his self-imposed task, nature reclaims her rights, invading, undermining, destroying, or disfiguring all his work. She seems to grow impatient at having to tolerate the masterpieces of his imagination and the work of his hands. For what do the Parthenon, or St. Peter's in Rome, or so many other miracles of art signify to the march of the seasons, or to the courses of the sea, the rivers and the winds? An earthquake or the lava from a volcano can destroy them in the twinkling of an eye. The birds nest in their ruins, and the wild beasts drag the bone of their founders from the open graves. The world was not made for man. Man is the master of nature and is mastered by it. He is the only living creature who not only resists but overcomes the laws of nature and extends his authority by energy and force of will. But to say that the universe was made for man is a very different matter. All man's constructions are as transitory as himself. Time overthrows his buildings and blocks his canals. It reduces his knowledge to nothing and obliterates the very names of his nations. I smell sulfur. Let me hear no more of this absurd maxim. We need the new. We must follow our century. Everything changes. Everything is changed. Sophistry, all of it. What do these so-called artists mean when they preach the discovery of the new? Is there anything new? Everything has been done. Everything has been discovered. Do not concern yourself with other people. Concern yourself with your own work alone. Drawing is the probity of art. To draw does not simply mean to reproduce contours. Drawing does not consist merely of line. Drawing is also the expression, the inner form, the plane, the modeling. See what remains after that. now hast thou but one bare hour to live, and then thou must be damned perpetually. In Germany, national political cohesion had existed in the loose confederation of states known as the Holy Roman Empire. During the war, Napoleon had occupied and controlled nearly all of Germany, and, after defeating his two main rivals, Prussia and Austria, dismantled the government of the Holy Roman Empire and imposed a new state called the Confederation of the Rhine. The decisiveness with which Napoleon had defeated the German states inspired outrage in its people and created a newfound sense of unity that would eventually contribute to the establishment of the political body of Germany that we know today. The 18th century saw many great German writers, poets, philosophers, and painters. Perhaps the greatest figure of German Romanticism was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose magnum opus was the play Faust. The story comes from a popular German folktale that had been interpreted in the past by Christopher Marlowe in England. In the original story, a scholar makes a deal with one of the devil's henchmen, Mephistopheles. For a period of time, Mephistopheles will use his magic to serve Faust, and in exchange, Faust promises the devil his soul. At the end of Marlowe's play, Faust pleads with God to save him and even attempts to repent, but ultimately he must descend to hell. Goethe worked on his version throughout his life, and his final resolution to the narrative, published after his death, paints a more optimistic picture of Faust. In the end, he redeems his soul and is saved.